Battle Stations missile for WSRT. Spin up all missiles.
This is Plausibly Live, the official podcast of the Dave Bowman Show.
In the spring of 46, before the Common Era, in fact, we know, because we have the surviving correspondence from it, we happen to know that it was a very nice, fine April day in the year 46 before the Common Era. It was near the coast of Italy, away from the hubbub, the center of events in Rome, where two men were walking along the road, much similar probably to the one behind me if you're watching the video. These were two very powerful men. They were men who were very engaged in the functioning of the government of the Republic of Rome. They were well-known men. And yet at the same time, even as they walked along that road, they knew that they were living on the wrong side of history. What do I mean? A few days before, the Battle of Pharsalus had been lost. The last Republican forces had been defeated by Julius Caesar. Cato, the leading Republican, was now dead. And both of these men, who were both very staunch Republican supporters, knew that they were in the dying days of the Roman Republic. They knew that it had been lost, that a combination of factors had multiplied to the point where there was literally nothing that could be done to save the Republic. Or at least that's what people seemed to believe. These two men, one is named Varro, and he is very well known to us from history. And the other is named Cicero. Cicero, no doubt you've heard of, as we've talked about the Anti-Federalists. Cicero is a leading Republican, and yet, even as a staunch opponent of Julius Caesar, he finds himself in the position of still being alive, and at the same time, not really knowing what to do. The Republic he knows is lost. It's gone. And he and Varro, walking along that road, find their conversation about what should we do now? We've lost the fight to save the Republic. It's clear that a bunch of factors, as I said, have conspired against us, and we no longer can win. Not only do we have the Julius Caesar issue, Julius Caesar, the would-be tyrant, the dictator, who has destroyed Republican forces in Spain and now in Africa. They also are dealing with, and this is something we don't talk about much, a counterculture of progressivism that denigrates traditional Roman values. It looks at traditional Roman values and says, we don't need that. Why do we do things that way? Just because they did it that way before doesn't mean we have to do it now. And this counterculture of the 60s and 50s of the BCE era has eroded Roman attributes to the point where many people find themselves questioning, why do we do it that way? Just because a bunch of old dead Romans did it that way a couple of centuries ago doesn't mean we should do it that way now. Both of these men, Cicero and Varro, have elected to go into quiet retirement. They have decided that we are no longer relevant, we are no longer needed in the government of the Republic, which shortly is going to cease to exist anyway. What should we do now with the remainder of our lives? They're both elderly men. They're both in their 60s. What do we do now? Where do we go? What do we do? Road takes us to one of their two homes where they can sit in quiet retirement or perhaps come up with an idea of what they should do. You need to understand that for 3 centuries prior to this moment, since 509 BCE, that's actually 4 centuries, the Roman people, the Romans, had loved and revered their history. Even if it was a little murky in places, they saw their history as more than just a recording of what happened, or what should have happened, or what they wanted to have happen. They saw their history as the defining element of the Republican virtue, the Roman virtues. Every attribute of Rome and a Roman citizen was found somewhere in their history. They believed very strongly in the martial prowess of Rome, and this was based upon the founding of Rome in 753 BCE with Romulus and Remus, and the fact that they were militarily able to do this. They saw in the founding of the Republic in 509 BCE the defining attribute of a love of liberty. When Brutus, and we talked about this, Brutus and Publius, joined together to expel the Tarquin king and to found the Republic and to swear that liberty was their defining value and that they would oppose any king at any time. In 309 BCE, the Romans suffered a horrible defeat when the Gauls sacked Rome. Yes, long before the fall of Rome. They sacked Rome in 309 BCE. And this created in the Romans this mindset called Vae Victis, woe to the conquered. They understood that if they lost, their lives were going to suck. And so this Roman idea was born that we find even today in our popular culture. Never give up, never surrender. That is the very definition of a Roman. Never give up, never surrender. And in fact, Hannibal will use this very attribute against the Romans when he starts the Second Punic War. Liberty, never surrendering, understanding our place in history, these are all Roman attributes that come from and are defined by moments in their history which they constantly remind each other of. They constantly appeal to each other. In 218 BCE, when Scipio is raising his son who will later defeat Hannibal in the Second Punic War, the ideas that he impels to his son are based on these very attributes. He gives his son a speech about what is this attribute of history from? What this element of our history gives us what as Romans? And he goes through the whole list with him. It's a fascinating speech. I find myself wanting to do a similar speech with our own history. But now, on this April day in 46 BCE, the rules don't seem to matter anymore. The history doesn't seem to matter anymore. Caesar's breaking all the rules. He's crossed the Rubicon. He's established himself not just as consul, but as a dictator for more than 6 months, going on 3 years. And he's able to do this because there is a major decline in the country, in the virtues and in the attributes that Romans have held sacred throughout all their years. And because these attributes are being questioned, and because this history is being denigrated, because the foundational elements of Rome are being ignored, Julius Caesar is able to perform the acts that he is performing, which are leading to a tyranny. Sorry, there's no such word as tyranny. You get the idea. I really can't emphasize this enough. I know I've said it multiple times, but I want to say it again here. The founding and framing Americans, including both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, both sides, drew much of their inspiration from the late Roman Republic, from this moment in 46 BCE, where these two men, Cicero and Varro, are walking along the road. In fact, I'm going to say something that might sound a little strange right now, but I think it's this moment on that road as they walk, as Cicero and Varro walk. I think it's that moment that you can literally trace almost the beginning of American thought and American idealism in the revolutionary and constitutional eras. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, I can't overemphasize this enough, both appeal to this Roman history, to these ideals that Cicero and Varro are lamenting that day as having been lost. They don't see themselves just inspired by it. It's not something they look to and go, oh, well, that's something we should try to emulate. They see themselves, the framers, the Federalists, the Anti-Federalists, they see themselves as the ideological heirs of the Roman Republic. They see Cicero and Cato and Varro and others as being Americans. Not to be emulated, but to be part of us. They have a passion for liberty and for never giving up. This is Americans. I mean, the American Revolutionary War is a giant example of Americans' passion for liberty, for self-determination, and for not giving up for 8 years. They accept Roman history as fact, not as myth, but as history. Now, again, maybe some of that history is murky. Maybe some of it doesn't make sense. Maybe some of it is, I don't know, created. Who knows? But they accept this as fact. We talked about this with Brutus and the story of Lucretia and the assassination of the Tarquin king, son. It might be mythology, but they accept it as fact. And because they accept it as fact, this is our history, and this helps define who we are. And they see themselves in many of the same ways. We expelled a king and his tyrants. Today, we see a fundamental change in our nation, don't we? And it's been building for a long time. It's been building certainly since I was in radio. Some of the earliest calls I got were, Dave, where did it all go wrong? When did things change? What caused the change? And there are any number of answers. There are a lot of arguments about socialism and communism, and my grandfather was a firm believer that everything was a communist conspiracy. And maybe he was right, maybe he wasn't. I don't know. But there is one thing that I think we can point to on that road in 46 BCE that is so similar that even Cicero and Varro on that day recognized it for what it was. And they said to themselves, this is probably the point where things began really to go downhill. And what was that point? Well, it was the understanding of history, the interpretation, the application, the use of history as the defining element of our virtues and our attributes. And when that began to change, suddenly the old ways didn't make any sense anymore. When I set out on this voyage to study the Anti-Federalists, I wanted to answer to two questions. Were they right about things? And what can we, or I at least, learn from them? Those were the two things that I wanted to draw from the Anti-Federalists to see if there was anything for today. First question was, were they right? And like most things, when it comes to the Constitution, the answer to that question is yes and no. The Anti-Federalists clearly had a better understanding of human nature. They clearly had an understanding of the corruption that would be involved and the way that the Constitution as designed would fail. They clearly saw that. Where they fell down was they were not well organized, and they had a very short-sighted view of the future. They didn't understand that technology was going to change. They didn't understand that the world would get smaller. They did not understand that. And because of that, I think they had a certain a certain sensibility about things, particularly when it came to the United States' place on the world stage. And they didn't understand that a republic such as one we were building would be a leader, would have to be, eventually. And that even Rome as a republic was an imperialist society. It had to expand. And in much the same way, the United States had to expand. Those were normal things. They didn't understand that. The Federalists, of course, were potentially right about many things. The problem with the Federalists is that they are very Pollyannish about human nature. They're very Pollyannish about the people. They truly believed that the people would always be virtuous, knowing full well that history said, no, they won't. And all they had to do was look to the Romans, and they would have understood that. But somehow or another, they thought, this time it'll be different. This is, Dave's second law. People don't change. They do the same things for the same reasons with the same results. They just convince themselves that this time it'll be different. The Federalists, like I said, were very Pollyannish about the people, and they failed to understand that limits had to be imposed because otherwise corruption would come into place. The second question was more broad. What can I learn from, particularly the Anti-Federalists? Part of all this. As you know, I have been surprised by what I found. Things that I didn't quite comprehend, I guess, when I started this a few weeks ago, or months ago, whenever it was. I never expected to be this deep into Roman history. I didn't. I have an entire shelf of books now that I have purchased in the last 3 months that is nothing but Roman and Greek history. More Roman than Greek, but you get the idea. I have purchased courses that I've taken, lectures that I've listened to while I walk, and things like that have left me at times shaken, at times inspired, and I will be frank with you, at one point, absolutely emotional over some of the ideas that were being shared with me. It started with these 4 interpretations of history, these ideas that there are 4 ways to present history. The idea that you can present history as an editorial. It is editorialized. It always is, but you can do it as education. You can do it as enlightenment. You can do it as analysis. But most importantly, you can do it as celebration. And most history is presented as celebration. Most history, at some point, is celebratory. We celebrate the fact that George Washington threw $1 across the Delaware River. We celebrate the fact that he chopped down a cherry tree and could not lie about it. We celebrate these moments in our history. What we've also learned is that tyrannies shut down history as celebration. They can't have that. They can have history as education as long as it meets their certain editorial criteria. They can have enlightenment, and they can certainly have analysis as long as that analysis leads to the correct conclusions for them. Cannot have celebration. Celebration in history under a tyranny inspires people to oppose that tyranny, and they can't have that. And so whenever you see history being shut down, you almost have to assume that it's a tyranny. This has kind of become the core of my theory about what can I learn. Throughout history, especially on that day in 46 BCE, each time a society changes, that change comes about because that society changes how it looks at its own history. It looks at its history differently. Prior to the civil wars in the 1st century BCE in Rome, Roman attributes and virtue were found in its history, as I talked about. In 753, the founding. 509, the Republic. 303, Ve Victa. These ideas were generated in history, and they studied these elements in history to remind themselves of who and what they were. And when we start to change that history, or at least change how we interpret that history, and we no longer interpret that history as supporting our virtues or our attributes, society inevitably changes. I could give you some examples. In the Bible, every time Israel wanders off the path in the Old Testament, what happens? God says, come back to me. Come back to the ways we've done this before. Come back to your history. And if they do, things are great. If they don't, things go in the tank. I read a story this week about Catholic bishops, Roman Catholic bishops, who are upset because the traditional liturgy in the Catholic Church is being eliminated. And they feel like this is an over-liberalization of things and that they're going to lose things with that. I sympathize with that because in the faith of my childhood, most of you know this, I grew up not Jewish, but in the faith that I grew up in, the Salvation Army, we used to have a handbook of doctrine, which was a fascinating and detailed theological outline of what we believe. And we used to take classes on this stuff. And about 15, 20 years ago, that book was just too hard. So we dumbed it down. We literally turned it into a comic book. I mean, the quote that just killed me was, we eliminated so many of the discussions that we used to have about difficult things in our faith and our ideology. And I was told, there are things that are hard to understand. You just have to have faith. Well, but faith is built on something, or else it's not really faith. It's just belief. The sages, Jewish sages, teach that it's when people stop caring about their history, about their past, about their attributes, when they stop caring about the things that made them who they are, that's when evil sets in. And I would submit to you that much as the Romans had in the last century of the last century BCE, we have changed how we view our own history. Society, perhaps not you or I, but we have. There was a time when presidents would give speeches and appeal to figures in our history about what they did and who they were. When we wanted to inspire, we talked about our past. Who do we appeal to now in history when someone wants to inspire Americans? Who do they appeal to? Who do they talk about? Instead, we cancel culture our history, don't we? We take it and we go, well, that guy owned slaves, so he can't be inspiring to us, so we have to ignore everything about him. We cancel it, and we say, well, we're going to reinterpret this. Or, even worse, we revise the history. We change it to what we want it to be now. What do I mean? Well, instead of taking history at its foundational values and considering the attributes which it imbued into us, we revise it into something it never was. And then we hail that as the new history. How many people in this country today only know Alexander Hamilton through a musical, which might be great. I've not seen it, but it might be a great musical, but it's not history. And it certainly doesn't give us any reasons why we should be venerating him, does it? In fact, it kind of pushes us in the opposite direction in some way. When a society begins to change how it views its own history and how that history set that society's attributes and its virtues and its values, that society will change. And there will be those who will lament that change. And on that April day in 46 BCE, Varro and Cicero walking down that road, they knew that they had lost that fight. And I know that there are some who feel that our country, republic, is lost now, that it's inevitable, can't be stopped. We don't want it. We're thinking of ways that we can change that, but and we're not willing to give up that very Roman attribute of never give up, never surrender. But a longer view would teach us that we've changed how we view our history. We've changed how we view what is an American. And consequently, we may have lost that fight to save the republic. Cicero and Varro realize that their side, the Republicans, have lost their fight. The Republic is no more, except in name only. It's corrupted from within, with the loss of values and attributes, and it's attacked from without by those who see weakness and opportunity, people like Julius Caesar. But they have not committed suicide, as Cato did. They don't have the same reasons to that Cato did, but they still have hope for the future. And so, on that road, in April of 46 BCE, they come to a determination. They come to a decision about what to do to go forward. They write this. Cicero actually writes this, but Varro agrees. If anyone cares to call us as architects, or even as workmen, to build the Commonwealth, the Republic, we shall not say no. Rather, we will hasten cheerfully to that task. Future, we decide to rebuild the Republic, we're with you. But if our services are not required, we must still read and write books on the ideal republic. Even if this falls into empire and tyranny, even if it means our lives to read now forbidden history and write about forbidden things in the past, we must still do so, because the ideal republic is a goal worth serving. Their purpose becomes to educate on the history of the Roman people and the Roman Republic. They had failed to save that republic at this time. But because they were Romans, they refused to give up, never surrender. These two men, Cicero and Varro, particularly Cicero, inspired a new generation of people who would think like Romans. Cicero would go on to become an American icon. His ideas on liberty and republicanism, little r, not party r, would end up withstanding time. In the Enlightenment, the early 1700s, late 16, early 1700s, those ideas, which had been saved and preserved by Cicero and Varro, were reborn and reinvigorated. Montesquieu and others. And in many ways, Americans, steeped in this history, began to take on those Roman attributes: our love of liberty, our hatred of tyranny, our refusal to give up, to surrender, are all found there. Many today, as I said, and for many years, have felt our republic is either lost or on the verge of being lost, and perhaps it is. Perhaps it's 46 BCE again, and we're walking on that road together. We can ask the question, what can I learn from the Anti-Federalists, who learned in turn from the Romans? We can learn that, like those who inspired them, the fight is never over. It may take 2,000 years. You understand that? It may take 2,000 years. It may take longer. It may take less. But those ideas can never really fully die, because they will have been saved and recorded and presented for your consideration. It's only when people don't consider them and don't read them and don't pay attention to them that society begins to change. These ideas can be hidden away, like I said, by a lack of knowledge and a disregard for the past, but they're still there. And if that past is kept alive by just a small spark, it can be brought back to an understanding that the same ideas that drove Publius and Brutus to drive out the king, the same ideas that founded a republic on the idea of liberty, not freedom, liberty, the same ideas that refused to give up in the face of a disaster, the same ideas that two men walking down a road decided that they were going to go study read, though they already knew it, read more about, and write more about, and preserve for all time. And all those ideas can return with an even greater impact. But it falls to us, because you see, now we're the ones walking down that road, aren't we? And we have to decide. Are we Romans? Are we Americans? Do we just give up? Or are we Americans and Romans? Do we decide to continue to read, to study, to write, to talk, and preserve those ideas so that they are not lost forever?